Sun TV, Malcolm X documentary, from Birmingham, Alabama, USA to Birmingham, UK.
By any means necessary.
I am Malcolm X. I am Malcolm X.
I am Malcolm X. I've travelled to Birmingham, which is the UK's second largest city, in particular to Marshall Street, Smethwick, because my dear brother Malcolm X, also known as Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, actually visited this street back in 1965, 9 days before he was assassinated in New York at the Audubon Ballroom. He was invited by the Indian Workers Association, who invited him to see the onslaught of open racism for himself.
Marshall Street, this row of terrace cottages, then due east for 250 yards. An unlikely-looking street to have the most publicised name in Britain this week. On a bleak December afternoon, there seems nothing to distinguish it from thousands of terraced rows all over industrial Britain. Unpretentious and unlovely. Only one or two of the 100 houses in the street look shabby and uncared for. 26 of these houses are occupied by coloured families. About 100 of the street's 350 inhabitants are coloured men, women and children. Many streets in Smethwick have far bigger proportions of coloured people. So what's made Marshall Street famous, and for many infamous? It's here that the whites have banded together and look as though they'll persuade the Conservative-controlled council to halt the coloured invasion, to save Marshall Street, they say, from becoming a black ghetto.
He told reporters, "I have come here because I am disturbed by reports that coloured people in Smethwick are being badly treated. I have heard they are being treated as the Jews under Hitler. I would not wait for the fascist element in Smethwick to erect gas ovens." Malcolm X, remembered as one of the most prominent orators and revolutionaries of the 20th century, the larger-than-life figure of Malcolm X walking the red brick terraces of the small Midlands town of Smethwick, seemed today almost fantastical, but far from fiction. The now iconic photograph of Brother Malcolm standing tall on Marshall Street in February 1965 is a real and potent reminder of the international dimensions of the black freedom struggle. From Birmingham, Alabama, USA to Birmingham, England, UK. Malcolm X said, "I was in Birmingham, Alabama the other day. This will give me a chance to see if Birmingham, England is any different. I am disturbed by reports coloured people are being treated badly. I have heard they are being treated as Jews were under Hitler. Even in the 1960s, the policy for Marshall Street appalled people. Malcolm X believed it was only the beginning of something else that, left unchecked, would see Britain start to repeat the horrors that befell Jews in the Holocaust. I would not wait for the fascist element in Smethwick to erect gas ovens," he said. Marshall Street in Smethwick was especially problematic, with residents lobbying the council to buy up empty houses along the street and make them available only to white families. The Conservative Council agreed to the demands of the racists to stop non-white people from moving in. Black and Asian families were prevented from purchasing or renting properties on Marshall Street, and the situation carried on for several years.
It's here that Smethwick Council will decide whether to act, by buying up Marshall Street houses that come on the market, then letting them to white families on the housing list. The Housing Committee chairman is Councillor Gould.
Where do you intend to put the coloured people who can't get houses in Marshall Street?
Well, that isn't our problem. That is the problem of the immigrant himself.
But aren't you removing a free market? Surely you've got then to provide an alternative.
No, not exactly. What we do think that this road must not be completely taken over by immigrants. We think this would be segregation, and that is the last thing we want if we want the coloured people to settle down amongst the white residents of this road.
Despite Labour cries of colour bar, the Conservative Council's Marshall Plan is almost certain to go through. But will it bring the happy integration the Conservatives say they want? The Sikh owner of the biggest house in the street, Yalman Singh, says he's never invited white neighbours into his house. They never invited him. Whites don't mix with coloureds. Sikhs don't mix with Jamaicans. The whites say they want to keep the proportion of coloureds within bounds, so they can help raise their standards and ways of living to the British level. But so far, with 6 years of coloured neighbours, nothing has been done. Marshall Street prepares for Christmas, but the old message of goodwill to all men as stony ground to work on here. As the people settle snugly into their tight little houses, they wonder what Marshall Street's 79th New Year will bring to this part of what's called the Black Country.
After looking at Marshall Street, at the far end of the street, a group of white women shouted abuse at him, but he did not respond to them. He calmly walked back to where we were standing. Malcolm wanted to walk on Marshall Street alone. He told us he was disgusted by what he had seen. He said it was worse than some parts of the US. Malcolm challenged all racism. He was not just interested in African Caribbean people. If that was true, he wouldn't have come to Smethwick, where the focus was almost all on Asians. House number 58 is now demolished. It was the house for sale which Malcolm was reading the sign. The visit was not without incident either. Malcolm was taken to Marshall Street on that cold February day and heckled by the white residents living there, who were proud of the fact that they did not want to live alongside immigrants. They bluntly informed him that they did not want any more black people living in Smethwick. According to eyewitnesses, as the white people barracked Malcolm with abuse, he was loudly supported by the relatively few black and Asian people in the area. Malcolm X did not respond to the oppression he faced. He quietly walked down the street in observation. He was followed by a small number of journalists and a BBC camera crew that didn't air the footage until decades later, which shows just how impartial the BBC really is. Malcolm X was given a guided tour of Smethwick, its terraced streets, its pubs with no black signs decorating the windows, and its churches that turned immigrants away on a Sunday morning. Apparently, immigrants, whilst adhering to the same religion, could not share the same God, nor the same church to pray in. It was on this battleground of racial hatred that Malcolm X entered the scene. Smethwick was not on his original itinerary. Malcolm had planned to speak at universities in Britain, but on receiving an invitation from exiled Trinidadian communist Claudia Jones and Avtar Singh from the Indian Workers' Association, he decided he could no longer ignore the call from them.
During the last 2 years, Marshall Street has completely fallen apart. We have watched it happen. And this delegation to the council was purely to try and make a stand to stop the road completely being taken over by coloured people. As I say myself, for ourselves, only being residents in Marshall Street 4.5 years, but we're proud of this house that we're buying, and we want to keep the road reasonably clean and fit to live in, and to live peaceably with the coloured people, providing it was on 50-50 basis. But if all these houses that we know are for sale or potential for sale in the near future do go to coloured people, we shall definitely be outnumbered in this road.
By the mid-60s, around 75,000 immigrants every year arrived in the UK from the ex-British Empire colonies. Although arriving as British citizens to the mother country, they were greeted with outright racism, discrimination and hostility as soon as they stepped foot in the UK. This hostility was multifaceted, carried out both by individuals and the state, and included verbal abuse, beatings from National Front fists, racist graffiti sprayed on houses, firebombed windows, racist policing, and restricted access to housing and employment. Birmingham and the West Midlands became a popular landing spot for the Commonwealth diaspora, with the majority being Indian Sikhs, but there was also a substantial number of people from Pakistani and Caribbean communities. The locals were overwhelmingly against their arrival, and tensions in the area were high, exacerbated by factory closings and housing shortages after Birmingham lost around 100,000 homes during the Second World War. The town had become a byword for racial division after the successful candidate Peter Griffiths, who was a Tory, was elected to power off the back of a racist campaign. Marshall Street epitomised what risked becoming a battleground between the indigenous population and new arrivals from the West Indies, India and Pakistan. In what would become one of the most infamous election campaigns in British history, the Conservative Party selected Peter Griffiths as their candidate, whose explicitly anti-immigration and segregationalist platform was epitomised by his racist slogan. Marshall Street itself became a flashpoint when local white residents proposed that the council acquire every house on the road in order to enforce this segregation. The group of residents, led by Alice Groves, got their way, but the plan was eventually vetoed by the Ministry of Housing. Faced with mounting tension over immigration, the town's council was lobbied by local residents to buy any properties that came onto the market and let them only to white families.
West Indians are Marshall Street's minority group. Most of the coloureds here are Sikhs. The fathers are making good money in steel and car factories. The families often speak little English, the wives least of all. They're suspicious and camera shy. The first house to go coloured. The man of the house, a Jamaican, is in prison now serving 12 months for indecent assault on a 14-year-old girl. Marshall Street remembers this. Number 7 has just been sold to a coloured family, price said to be £950. Bigger houses further along fetch up to £3,000. It's 3.5 years since a white family moved in. One man has seen the street's whole history. He was born behind the bedroom window on the right, the year the street began. Now, 78 years later, Mr. Barnett lives just 2 doors away and speaks about his new neighbours.
Their way of living is not like the white people, see? Because what they cook, there's always fumes of oil coming from it, and that's what they don't like. Well, I don't suppose any white people would like it.
To show how times change and eventually how English people did like food cooked with fumes, in 2001, Robin Cook, the then Foreign Secretary, announced in a speech, "Chicken tikka masala is now a true British national dish, not only because it is the most popular, because it is a perfect illustration of the way Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. Chicken tikka is an Indian dish. The masala sauce was added to satisfy the desire of British people to have their meat served in gravy."
I work with them on the railway, and I've got quite nice friends on the railway, and I deal with a lot of them that come to the church here to get married and to christen their babies, and I get along all right with the Jamaicans anyhow.
Racist attacks on the Afro-Caribbean and Asian residents of Smethwick were commonplace, from slurs and insults to bricks hurled through the windows of unwanted families. Daily life in Smethwick was governed by racist intimidation and discrimination.
The standard of living is very, very low amongst the coloured people. If there were less of them, perhaps, and more of us, then they would learn to live as we do. But as it is, they're just living in their own little communities and living how they lived, probably in India or wherever it was they came from. And the standard of living is very low.
First-hand, Malcolm saw how racism in the UK was not at all that different to its operation in the US. Brits are often keen to point out that racism in the UK is not institutionalized in the way it is in the US, but here, right in the middle of the country, is an example of how the local authorities, at the behest of the white working classes, with the backing of central government, enacted a policy of segregation in Smethwick.
Got some terrible habits, and as I've told you, with the things that we've seen them do in the streets, as regards of emptying the chambers in the gutter, they used to put the children on the pavement to do the business, and also when they come from the pubs at night, they're half slewed, they come along using the street as a urine, doing it as they're walking along.
Have you seen this yourself?
Definitely, yes. And also, they use the back gardens for toilets. I don't think they know what the toilets are for.
The white people in this street say that the West Indians are unsanitary in their habits. True?
That's a lie. If you get to the full understanding of the matter, the white people are more sanitary more than the colored people, if you don't mind I say so. For one reason, the colored people, they won't buy a house without it has a bath. There's thousands of these white people who live in a house without having bath.
When I drive on the motorway, I often see English people park their cars on the side of the road and use it as a toilet instead of using the motorway service stations. Also, when I walk through city centre streets in the mornings, I find rivers of urine. In true British fashion, one of Malcolm's first stops on his guided tour of Smethwick was the Blue Gates pub. Like many of Britain's free houses, the Blue Gates operated a colour bar, an informal system of segregation that saw black and brown people refused entry or service. It was here that Malcolm saw firsthand the insidious nature of segregation in Britain. Some bars and pubs had signs displayed in windows stating "No coloureds." Malcolm was shocked that an open colour bar existed in Britain. By that time, it was not legal in the US. When Malcolm and Aftar entered the smokeroom of the Blue Gates pub with IWA members, they were told that they had to buy their drinks elsewhere because they were black. Refused service in the Blue Gates, Malcolm and his IWA entourage proceeded to the public bar where Africans, Caribbeans and South Asians drank together. It mattered not whether you were an Indian Sikh, a Pakistani Muslim, Jamaican or Ghanaian, or were rendered black once they disembarked onto British soil. Malcolm shook the hand of every person of colour who was there. He kept his calm, but was disgusted by what he saw at Marshall Street and the Blue Gate pub. The Labour government passed the first Race Relations Act later in 1965, which outlawed discrimination in public places such as pubs. By the 1966 election, anti-racist work on the ground affected the Labour Party. Labour candidate Andrew Foulds confronted Griffiths over racism, and he won the seat back. After ads, the IWA devoted its energies to demonstrating that racism is a product of capitalism and that the workers, no matter where they came from, shared common interests. What is racism? It's a belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. Racism is not appreciating other races, cultures or religions. It is fear of other people from a culture other than your own. When you travel to other countries or even meet other people than you appreciate that you have more similarities with them rather than having differences with them. We have different colours, but we bleed the same. O mankind, indeed we created you from a male and a female and made you nations and tribes that you may identify yourselves with one another. Indeed the noblest of you in the sight of Allah is the most God-wary among you. Indeed Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. Excerpt from the last sermon of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action.
Indian's conversation with a white barber when he entered a saloon with a BBC radio microphone in his pocket.
No.
What's the matter?
No. I'm closed now.
What are you going to put the clothes on outside in the window, did you?
Will you clear off?
You're not closed. You ain't closed yet.
Well, I am to you.
1965 saw open racism. Now, even in 2022, that overt racism has moved underground and is more concealed, but it is still there nonetheless. In 2022, there are still problems within the very streets Malcolm X visited. Deprived neighbourhoods, lack of education, unemployment, housing and homelessness, marginalised and disadvantaged young people, mental health and gender inequality. A blue plaque commemorating the visit was installed at Marshall Street in 2012 by the Nubian Jack Community Trust in association with Sandwell MBC, Recognise Black Heritage and Culture, African Caribbean Self-Help Organisation and the Indian Workers Association, GB. In Marshall Street, using the latest figures released in the 2011 census, it showed that the largest residential ethnic group were white at 27%. However, that majority disappears as the white residents are outnumbered 3-1 overall compared to non-white residents. In the UK, we have an Indian Prime Minister whose name is Rishi Sunak, who is also the richest Prime Minister ever. Rishi is the second non-white Prime Minister ever in post, with Benjamin Disraeli, who was of Italian Jewish descent. What change did Benjamin bring? By having an Asian Prime Minister, does racism towards Asians disappear? No, it doesn't. As Brother Malcolm said, democracy is hypocrisy. And yet there has been progress in Smethwick, as Sam Moore described in his commemoration of the visit for Verso last year. Pubs have been converted into curry houses, Polish supermarkets, Turkish barbers and Indian sari shops have popped up all over town. Black, brown and white people all live together side by side in relative harmony. The largest Sikh temple in all of Europe stands proudly in Smethwick, a lush middle finger to the apocalyptic hatred of Griffiths, Powell and other racist demagogues. His solidarity made a strong impression on local activists, who credit him with helping give them the strength to carry on fighting the war against racism and discrimination. Peter Griffiths, meanwhile, was unable to fulfill his dreams of a British apartheid, being unseated by Labour candidate Andrew Folds in 1966. His racist vision of UK's white-only streets and black-only streets would have been a model which the rest of the UK would have followed in surely. That would have pushed back equal rights right back, and it would have taken a breakthrough person or event to tread water. UK apartheid did not materialise, and the UK did not follow South African's apartheid, which ended in 1994. US civil rights broke American segregation in 1968. However, present-day Palestinians still live under apartheid, which is ironic as the UK initiated this with the Balfour Declaration. The job of liberating Palestine will fall to Imam Mehdi, peace be upon him, along with Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, inshallah. Just like Lenox Avenue in New York is also named Malcolm X Boulevard, and Main Street in Lansing, Michigan is now Malcolm X Street, I think that Marshall Street, Birmingham, UK should be named Malcolm X Street. As I leave Marshall Street, Birmingham, I leave behind memories of Malcolm X's visit on that day in February 1965. Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz is long gone, but in our ongoing struggle for racial justice, his legacy lives on. Rest in peace, Brother Malik. Assalamu alaikum.